This is Aion class number 21. Our assignment covers paragraphs 347 through 367, and we are beginning on chapter 14, entitled The Structure and Dynamics of the Self. I have 7 themes I hope to get to tonight. Number 1 is Jung's method. Number 2, the mononymous text. Number 3, the Upanishads. Number 4, the reciprocality principle. Number 5, the uncertainty principle. Number 6, the double Moses quaternio. And number 7, handwriting. In the early part of this chapter, Jung summarizes the various symbols of the self that have been previously discussed. And this provides an occasion for me to outline or summarize Jung's methodology in this investigation, which I think is worth a few remarks to be sure that it's completely understood. As you remember, he subtitles Aion Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self. That's a very scientific subtitle. And I want to remind you of Jung's strict scientific empirical method as it's demonstrated in this work. And I think you'll all agree that these recent assignments have been difficult. They take hard work to understand. And one might be tempted to ask, is there not an easier way to present the material than the way Jung did it? But the fact is, there's very good reason for the way it's being presented. Since he is being strictly empirical, that means that he is presenting us with a strictly objective study of certain imagery of the psyche, specifically the archetypal psyche and the archetype of the self. And in order to investigate the depth psyche, which is what he's doing here, he has to deal with its manifestations the same way that an archaeologist deals with the manifestations of a lost civilization that's buried in the earth. He has to dig it out and then present and order and classify the artifacts, the data that he digs, that he reaches by his digging. Now, this digging can be done in 2 places when one's studying the psyche. It can be, you can dig in the individual psyche, and that's, in that case, we examine dreams and fantasies and unconscious symptoms and the phenomena that develop in the course of a depth analysis. That's individual archaeology, so to speak. The other way one can dig is one can dig in the collective psyche. And in that case, the archaeological data are found in religions, myths, fairy tales, such material as that, which correspond to the collective dreams and fantasies, but they're manifestations of the collective psyche. And in his study of alchemy and Gnosticism, Jung is doing the latter. He is excavating the collective psyche, so to speak. He's digging below its surface phenomena. It's hard work, and it does not make for smooth going, but it's the only way to explore the psyche if one is going to do it with strict objectivity and not just impose theoretical preconceptions on it in advance. You see, if you do that, then you impose a meaning on the data in advance, and that makes it understandable and easy to read, but it's not its meaning achieved a priori to the finding of the data, you see, and that's not appropriate empirical investigative procedure. To be proper, one must get the data first and then draw one's conclusions from the data rather than the other way around. Now, the Gnostics are particularly interesting in this respect also, as I mentioned last time, because they illustrate the associational amplifying process of the unconscious. And they illustrate, for example, they take the two great roots of the Western psyche, namely Greek mythology and the Hebrew Christian scriptures, and assimilate both those root sources to their own doctrine. And the way they did it is illustrated in their works, which Jung summarizes. And as I mentioned last time, their method of assimilating traditional material follows the same kind of pattern as that of depth psychology, because that associational amplificational method is the way the psyche functions. Now, Jung makes an important statement on this matter in volume 13. In paragraph 352, in the essay on the philosophical tree, Jung is talking about the importance of comparative research into symbols, which is just what Aion is. And in talking about that, he makes the following comment, and I quote: "This is an important statement, an important methodological statement." This is in paragraph 353. "In consequence of the collective nature of the image, it is often impossible to establish its full range of meaning from the associative material of a single individual. Thus, the necessity of comparative research into symbols. For this purpose, the investigator must turn back to those periods in human history when symbol formation still went on unimpeded. That is, when there was still no epistemological criticism of the formation of images, and when, in consequence, facts that in themselves were unknown could be expressed in definite visual form. And the period of this kind closest to us is that of medieval natural philosophy, which attained its most significant development in alchemy and Hermetic philosophy." End quote. One could add that a more remote example of this same material is found in the fantasy systems of the Gnostics. Now, the crucial statement here is when there was still no epistemological criticism of the formation of images. That means it was a time of a naive attitude which did not distinguish clearly between subject and object, or between inner and outer reality. You see, as soon as some epistemological sophistication, that just means an ability to criticize the process of knowing. As soon as one gets a bit of epistemological sophistication, then he no longer naively projects his inner fantasy imagery into the outer world, because he's got some inkling that he's revealing himself when he does that, and he becomes shy or self-critical about behaving that way. Now, of course, as we all know, there are plenty of people still around who have very little epistemological criticism. But Jung is talking about the cultural development of the race, and the race first began to learn epistemological criticism along about the 16th century. The philosophical ones that brought that to the fore were Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. Anyway, I urge you to reflect on that particular passage, because if you don't understand Jung's methodology, then you've missed the whole point. Then you won't understand why all his later books are written the way they are. You'll think he's just being an obscurantist. You won't understand.
Tell me the paragraph.
That's CW 13, paragraph 353. Okay, theme number 2 is the monogamous text. You know, last week's assignment had a quotation from monogamous concerning the jot and the dot. And this week begins with another quote from monogamous. He was a second century Gnostic whose right is completely unknown. All we know about him is a few scattered quotations. We do know that he was named the Arab. But here's a quote that Jung repeats from Hippolytus, which is quite psychologically remarkable, coming from the 2nd century. Quote, Seek him from out of thyself, and learn who it is that taketh possession of everything in thee, saying, My God, my spirit, my understanding, my soul, my body, and learn whence is sorrow and joy, and love and hate, and waking though one would not, and sleeping though one would not, and getting angry though one would not, and falling in love though one would not. And if thou shouldst closely investigate these things, thou wilt find him in myself, the one and the many, like to that little point, for it is in thee that he hath his origin and his deliverance. It's an amazing text for the 2nd century. A modern psychologist couldn't put it more succinctly. You see, it tells us that we should make a distinction, discriminate between our own will and the unconscious. And the ability to make that distinction is the crucial discovery in the process of discovering an encounter with the self. We first have to realize that we are not one but two, that there's an other inside. And as that dawns on us, we discover at the same time that much of what we do in our daily life is not our choice or will at all. We discover ourselves doing things that hadn't been intended, not to mention overt slips and accidents and very crude demonstrations of challenges to our inclination. And as we become more and more aware of that two-ness, the more we realize the reality of the self. And that's what Monoemus is stating in this passage. This text then takes Jung to the Upanishads. As he says, one cannot help being reminded of the Upanishads. That comes up, and then he gives a couple of quotes in paragraphs 348 and 349. Upanishads are something that you should all have at least a nodding acquaintance with. They are ancient Hebrew scriptures. The word literally means
Hebrew.
Well, did I say Hebrew? Yeah. Hindu. Hindu. The Hebrews aren't the only ones that have scriptures. Hindus have scriptures too. I must remind my unconscious of that fact. And the word literally means sitting near devotedly, which means it's a setting whereby one receives a secret teaching from a teacher, in which knowledge, divine knowledge, is communicated. The Upanishads were written in Sanskrit and were unavailable to anyone who did not know that language until 1650 AD. Give or take 2 or 3 years. That's close enough date to remember it by. At which time they were translated into Persian. So if you knew Persian, you could then read the Upanishads. They did not reach Western Europe until 1800, 1801 to be exact, when the Persian translation of the Upanishads was translated into Latin. And I spell out these details because they're very important. Their influence very quickly manifested itself. The most notable person who was influenced by it was Schopenhauer, whose whole philosophy is a kind of westernized, one-sided elaboration of the Upanishads. Another person that was much influenced by them was Nietzsche was much influenced by them, and so was Jung, both directly and through Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. And he took the term self from the Upanishads. He gives a couple of quotes from them. I want to give you those same quotes in slightly larger form because it makes them more visible, gives them a little more impact if you hear the larger version. At whose behest does the mind speak? Who bids the body live? Who makes the tongue speak? Who is that effulgent being that directs the eye to form and color and the ear to sound? The self is ear of the ear, mind of the mind, speech of the speech. He's also breath of the breath and eye of the eye. Him the eye does not see, nor the tongue express, nor the mind grasp. Him we neither know nor are able to teach. Different is he from the known, and different is he from the unknown. That which is not comprehended by the mind, but which the mind comprehends, know that to be Brahman. That which is not seen by the eye, but by which the eye sees, know that to be Brahman. That which is not heard by the ear, but by which the ear hears, know that to be Brahman, etc. And in another place, he who dwells in all beings, but is separate from all beings, whom no being knows, whose body all beings are, and who controls all beings from within, he, the self, is the inner ruler, the immortal. Now those words were written at least no earlier than 500 BC. So that goes to show you how the East, notably India, in psychological sophistication is far beyond the West. Number 4, the reciprocality principle. The reference to this is found in paragraph 355, where Jung speaks of the self as being a true complexio oppositorum. Paragraph 355. The self is a true complexio oppositorum, though this does not mean that it is anything like as contradictory in itself. It's quite possible that the seeming paradox is nothing but a reflection of the enantiodromian changes of the conscious attitude. The same is true of the unconscious in general, for its frightening figures may be called forth by the fear which the conscious mind has of the unconscious. The importance of consciousness should not be underrated. Hence, it's advisable to relate the contradictory manifestations of the unconscious causally to the conscious attitude, at least in some degree. Now, Jung is here referring to what I want to underline by baptizing it a fancy name. It's what I call the reciprocality principle, and I think it's important enough to warrant such a name, because if you really understand how this works, it's very valuable. I'm using the word reciprocal as it's used in mathematics. The reciprocality principle states that the unconscious responds inversely to the conscious ego. That's the reciprocality principle. And what I mean by that is this. We know that every number in mathematics has a reciprocal. The reciprocal of 5 is 1/5. To find a reciprocal, one has to turn a whole number into a fraction, or into a fractional notation at least. In other words, has to turn it into a double term. The reciprocal of 2/3 is 3/2. See, the idea is that reciprocality can exist only when two terms exist. So that a whole number has to be turned into a fractional expression. When one multiplies two reciprocals, the product is always 1. That's psychologically significant, I think. Now, this is all relevant to the ego's relation to the unconscious. The ego's relation to any particular psychological quality or content can be expressed in a fractional term. And then, according to the reciprocality principle, the unconscious manifestation of that quality will be an inverse ratio or a reciprocal of the conscious manifestation. Let me give you an example of that. I put an example on the board. Let's say we're dealing with the quality of aggressivity on a scale of 10. So at 0 would be total victim, total quivering, knee shaking, fleeing victim. At the other end, 10 would be total aggressor, chasing, attacking, totally. Well, let's say that our particular ego is very much in the victim realm. Let's say he's got an aggressivity fraction of 2/10. That means he's very much victim. He's only got 2 out of 10 of an aggressive tendency. By this principle, then, the unconscious will have a aggressivity fraction of 10/2. In other words, if the ego is very much identified with being the victim, the unconscious will have the aggressor constellated in it and will start chasing the ego. And the ego, of course, will be running. Now, we all know in observing animals that if one animal runs, if a cat runs, the dog would chase it. If the cat stops running and turns around, the dog suddenly stops, and it might start running, you see. That illustrates how the unconscious can work. And this works not only within the individual, it also works in the individual's relation to his environment. If I behave in very much of a weak, fearful victim role here at my desk, it won't be long before this whole crowd will be after me. I can promise you. That's the way the unconscious works. And this is the way the transference and the countertransference work, too. So that if you have a patient who is very much identified with the victim, no matter how mild-mannered and gentle you may think you are, if you're alert, you'll catch yourself bullying him or her, because that's what's constellated. And it works in all sorts of other qualities too. You see, characteristically, a patient comes to see us because the patient is feeling sick, weak, or wounded. And then that constellates in the analyst the contrasting powers of health, power, healing. And as long as those things just remain carried by the analyst, they don't help the patient at all. And the task is how to reverse those reciprocal fractions to know how to hand over what's been constellated in the analyst and how to hand it back to the patient. And that's not so easy to do. It's easier said than done. But it's a big help, at least to know what's going on. And I think the reciprocality principle is helpful there. I use that term rather than calling it reciprocity because reciprocity carries ordinarily a different meaning. Mutuality, it's a different kind of meaning for us. Okay, another principle. Number 5. The uncertainty principle. This is also referred to in paragraph 355 on page 226, top of the page, where Jung says, between the conscious and the unconscious, there is a kind of uncertainty relationship because the observer is inseparable from the observed and always disturbs it by the act of observation. In other words, exact observation of the unconscious prejudices observation of the conscious, and vice versa. Now, Jung puts this term uncertainty relationship in quotes, indicating he has a particular reference there, and what he's referring to is the uncertainty principle of nuclear physics that was first formulated by Werner Heisenberg. This principle stated that the position and velocity of a subatomic object cannot both be measured exactly at the same time, even in theory. That's because any attempt to measure precisely the velocity of a subatomic particle, such as an electron, knocks it about in an unpredictable way, so that if its velocity is to be measured, then the very act of observing it upsets its position. Or if its position is to be measured, then that alters its velocity. The idea is that the very act of observation of subatomic particles alters their condition, so that exact objective readings are impossible. It means then that the observer is drawn into the data he is observing and influences it in a unavoidable way. Now, precisely the same state of affairs pertains in our observation of the unconscious. You see, the unconscious is altered by the process of observation. That means that there's no such thing as an absolutely objective piece of psychological data from the unconscious, because in order to have observed that data, you as the observer had to have seen it, you have to have touched it, and you brought it back, and in the process of doing all that, you put your fingerprints on it. The unconscious is altered by the process of observation. But the reverse is also true. Both the observer and the observed influence each other. Not only does the ego influence the unconscious when it observes it, but also the unconscious, the self, modifies the ego by observing it. Because the observation process is a two-way street. That may not be immediately evident to you, but it can be demonstrated with a lot of psychological data, I assure you. There's an eye of God aspect to the self, which observes the ego, just as the ego, when it reaches a certain level, can observe the self. So that's what Jung is referring to in that reference to the uncertainty relationship. Number 6, the doubling of the Moses quaternity. Jung now returns to the Moses quaternio that had been brought up earlier and elaborates it. And he reaches a conclusion that just as there is an upper and a lower atom in that triad that created the Moses quaternio, so there must be an upper and a lower quaternio of the 4 figures in the Moses family. And he proceeds to chart it the way I put it on the blackboard. Now, it's important that you get this because he's going to build further on this structure. He's not through with this. It's going to be built up more. So let me just remind you of what we're dealing with here. We're dealing first with a higher atom, an anthropos figure, that splits into 4, and those 4 figures then synthesize or unite into a lower atom. And those 4 figures of the quaternio are Moses, Moses, Jethro, Miriam, and Zipporah. Moses, you remember, kills the slave driver and flees to Midian. He meets Jethro, his future father-in-law, and he marries Jethro's daughter, Zipporah. And the 4th figure is Miriam, who was Moses' sister. She was the one who took him in the ark of bulrushes and put him in the stream for Pharaoh's daughter to find him. Now, Miriam, Moses' sister, was called in one scripture a prophetess, a seer. So that aspect of her characterizes the higher Miriam. But in another place, she spoke against Moses. She was angry with Moses because he married Zipporah, and she incurred Yahweh's wrath, and he turned her white as a leper until he relented. So the angry, vengeful Miriam is the lower Miriam. Zipporah was the daughter of Jethro, who was the priest of Midian, and I'm trying to recall. Her negative aspect was that in one text, she's called the Black Ethiopian. So, with that shadow quality, that makes her the negative Zipporah, and therefore relegated to the lower quaternial. But in other scriptures, she's the wise Zipporah, and there she will occupy the upper quaternia as the upper Zipporah. Then the same doubleness applies to Jethro. He's a priest of Midian, and therefore has the wisdom that accompanies priestly knowledge. But on the other hand, he was outside the traditional Israelite realm, and by being that kind of pagan outsider, in that aspect, he's the lower Jethro. And then the same thing applies to the two Moses, the higher Moses and the lower or carnal Moses. And what you can understand about this image so far, what's called the lower Adam in the picture, that's us. That's the ego. That's the ordinary empirical ego. So the ego occupies that mid-position, so to speak. And if it looks in one direction, it encounters a quaternity of an upper nature, of a light, bright, spiritual quality. If it looks in the opposite direction, it encounters a dark, shadow, dubious quaternity that if he looks all the way through it, he can even see the serpent. So that's the empirical aspect of this chart as it manifests itself so far. But we're not through yet, because it's going to get more complex than this. My time is up now, so I'm going to leave item number 7 for next time.